The 80s and my arrival to the world. Let me start with a revelation that always surprises people. I was born in 1981, at the height of the disco pop era and giant shoulder pads. This technically makes me a child of the 80s, but the truth is, I'm genuinely a 90s soul. From the 80s, I inherited only fragmented memories. The smell of extra strong hairspray my mother used, the distant sound of Michael Jackson's vinyl spinning on the secondhand record player in the living room, and some embarrassing photos where I appear in colorful overalls and neon socks that, for some inexplicable reason, my parents found adorable. I grew up watching the end of the Cold War through the innocent eyes of a child who didn't understand why adults were celebrating so much about the fall of a wall in a distant place called Berlin. For me, the 80s were just the prelude to my true cultural formation that would happen in the following decade, rocked by Nirvana, Friends, and the rise of the internet. The meeting worthy of a script. When Shakespeare promoted a romance. The story of how my parents met seems to have been written by Shakespeare himself, if he had been born in Hollywood and drunk too much coffee. My father, Thomas, was a theater professor at a performing arts school in Los Angeles, where he taught classes of young aspiring actors, including my mother. Yes, you read that correctly. He taught the art of acting to her. The plot twist no one expected? My father was younger than my mother, about 2 years younger to be exact. It was 1977, and Los Angeles was buzzing with post-Star Wars energy. The city was full of young dreamers who believed they could be the next Harrison Ford or Carrie Fisher. The art school where they met was in an old building on Sunset Boulevard, with peeling walls and an air conditioning system that worked through sheer willpower. The classrooms had worn wooden floors, mirrors on the walls, and a permanent smell of old coffee and youthful hope. Imagine the scene. My father, Thomas, at just 22 years old, a young professor with disheveled brown hair and thick-framed glasses that gave him an intellectual air. He had graduated early in English literature and theater from Yale, and always carried a worn edition of Shakespeare's complete works under his arm. He wore tweed blazers with patches on the elbows even in the California heat, spoke with impeccable diction that made each word sound like poetry, and had the habit of quoting Hamlet at the most unexpected moments. To be or not to be, that is the question, he would say when the waiter asked if he wanted sweetener in his coffee. My father was the type of person who used words like ephemeral, quintessence, and mellifluous in casual conversations, dressed as if he had stepped out of a BBC production about 19th century romantic poets, and could recite all 154 of Shakespeare's sonnets by heart, in numerical or alphabetical order depending on his mood that day. The students' theories about the mysterious professor. Meanwhile, at the back of the classroom, my mother and her friends formed a small observation and analysis club of the enigmatic professor, as they called him. Between diction exercises and improvisation, they whispered their theories. "This Thomas is a catch, but obviously he's gay," my mother would say, adjusting her purple bandana in her curly hair. "No heterosexual has such an overwhelming passion for Shakespeare." "Did you see how he recites the sonnets?" whispered Patty, her best friend, an aspiring actress with freckles and Broadway ambitions. "That's not just academic passion, darling. That's real passion. And that way he crosses his legs when he sits? Totally too refined for a straight guy from the 70s, added Denise, the third in the group, while chewing gum and flipping through her copy of The Stanislavski Method. Besides, my mother concluded with the certainty of someone solving an Agatha Christie mystery, he has an obsession with British literature, wears scarves around his neck in the middle of the California summer, and never looks at anyone's cleavage during classes, clearly gay. The consensus among the students was unanimous. Thomas was adorable, brilliant, charming in his peculiar way, but definitely romantically inaccessible to any of them. It was like having a literary unicorn as a professor. Wonderful to admire, impossible to conquer. The unexpected conquest, when the student challenged the professor. But my mother was never the type to be content with just theorizing about life. Born in the Bronx and raised by a single mother who worked as a nurse in double shifts, she learned early on that the world doesn't hand anything to you on a silver platter. With her extremely strong character and a determination that could move mountains, characteristics that, unfortunately or fortunately, I inherited in double dose and with interest, she decided it was time to test her theory. "I'm going to find out if he's really gay or just too shy for his own good," she announced to her friends after the third week of classes. "How?" asked Patty, widening her eyes. I'm going to seduce him in the name of science and female curiosity, my mother replied with a smile that mixed determination and mischief. You're crazy, exclaimed Denise. He's our professor. Besides, if he really is gay, you'll face the biggest embarrassment of your life. Calculated risk, my mother shrugged. And if I'm wrong, well, he's beautiful in a nerdy way and knows more about literature than any man I've ever met. Worst case scenario, I gain a cultured friend. Best case scenario, I discover that behind those glasses and Shakespearean quotes, there's a passionate man waiting to be discovered. The plan was put into action on a rainy Thursday, something rare in Los Angeles, which my mother interpreted as a favorable cosmic sign. That day's class had been particularly intense, focused on the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet. My father had demonstrated how Romeo should express his desperate love, reciting the lines with so much emotion that some students, including my mother, felt a lump in their throats. When the class ended and all the other students had left, my mother remained, arranging her things with deliberate slowness. My father, distracted as always, was organizing his notes and probably already mentally planning his next lesson on A Midsummer Night's Dream. She approached him with the most academic excuse she could come up with. Professor Thomas, she began, adjusting the strap of her macrame bag on her shoulder, I think I misunderstood Stanislavski's concept of emotional memory. When you say we should look to our personal experiences to build authentic emotion on stage, does that mean we need to have experienced exactly that emotion? My father looked at her over his glasses, genuinely interested in the question. Excellent question, he replied, immediately entering professor mode. Stanislavski doesn't suggest that we need to have lived exactly the same situation, but rather that we should find in our emotional memory something that evokes similar feelings. For example, you don't need to have lost a great love to play Juliet, but you need to access some significant loss you have experienced. Fascinating, my mother replied, taking a step forward. And if I've never experienced an overwhelming passion like Romeo and Juliet's, how can I interpret something I don't know? My father swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the proximity between them. Well, in that case, he nervously adjusted his glasses. Perhaps it's necessary to, observe, study, or experience it, my mother completed, with a smile that she would later describe as subtly predatory. Could we continue this discussion over coffee? She suggested, with studied innocence. I have many other questions about Stanislavski and Shakespeare that don't fit in class time. To the surprise of all her betting friends, who, by the way, were hiding in the hallway spying on everything through the half-open door, not only did my father accept the invitation, but he seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the idea of discussing theatrical techniques outside the academic environment. What started as a coffee to discuss Stanislavski turned into 3 consecutive coffees, a walk on Venice Beach at sunset, and culminated in a Hitchcock movie marathon in his tiny apartment, where it became absolutely clear that the theory about his sexuality was completely wrong. Completely wrong. As my father later confessed during a particularly wine-soaked Christmas, when I was old enough to hear the complete story, I was pathologically shy, not gay. I grew up in a family of academics where expressions of emotion were considered vulgar. I just didn't know how to approach women, especially women as intense and vibrant as your mother. She was like a colorful hurricane entering my monochromatic life of books and solitude. When she invited me for coffee, I spent 15 minutes in the bathroom having an internal conversation about how not to mess everything up. Shakespearean love. Intense, complicated, and full of dramatic monologues. What started as a bet between friends transformed into what both describe, to this day, as the great love of their lives. That first overwhelming love that runs you over like a runaway train, leaving you simultaneously devastated and more alive than you've ever been. It was the kind of passion that romantic poets tried to capture in verse. So intense that you can barely breathe when in the presence of the other, that transforms mundane activities like brushing teeth side by side into moments of profound intimacy, that functions as a merciless mirror where you see reflected all your deepest insecurities and wounds. 3 months after the first coffee, they were already living together in a tiny apartment in the Silver Lake neighborhood of Los Angeles. It was a third-floor walk-up, with a living room that barely accommodated a second-hand sofa and a bookshelf overflowing with books, a kitchen where only one person could move at a time, and a bedroom with a window that offered a privileged view of the brick wall of the neighboring building. The walls were too thin to contain the heated discussions they had about absolutely everything. Art. Abstract expressionism is revolutionary. My mother versus it's just paint randomly thrown on canvas. My father. Politics. Reagan is the end of civilization as we know it. Both agreed, at least on this. And which was the best Beatles album? My mother fiercely defended Abbey Road, arguing it was the perfect culmination of the band's musical evolution, while my father wouldn't give up on Sgt. Pepper's, insisting it was the definitive conceptual masterpiece. They never officially married, something that scandalized my father's traditional family in Connecticut. As my mother used to say, with that defiant tone she used when she wanted to end a discussion, "Why do we need a paper confirming something we feel in our hearts? True love transcends institutions created by the patriarchy to control women and their properties." Years later, when I was an adult, she admitted during an afternoon of confessions fueled by margaritas that in fact she had a dread of the bureaucracy involved in a marriage and an almost pathological aversion to filling out forms of any kind. Besides, she added, I knew we would eventually separate. We were too intense to last, like a supernova. Personalities in collision. When water and fire share the same space. They were like fundamental elements of nature that should never coexist in the same container. Water and oil, fire and ice, relentless pragmatism and dreamy rambling. Their personalities were so distinct that close friends wondered how they managed to share the same space without the universe imploding from the fundamental incompatibility. My father, Thomas, was the perfect archetype of the idealistic dreamer. Born into a family of academics from Connecticut, with a lineage that prided itself on having attended Yale for 3 generations, he lived in the ethereal world of arts and literature. For him, concrete reality was just an inconvenience that occasionally interrupted his contemplations about the profound meaning of an obscure line by T.S. Eliot. He woke up when his body naturally awakened, usually around noon, worked when inspiration knocked on the door, often at 3 a.m., and considered concepts such as punctuality, household budget, and long-term planning as bourgeois social constructs designed to stifle human creativity. His relationship with money was, at the very least, casual. He genuinely believed that the universe would provide what was necessary if he followed his artistic passion with enough devotion. Once, when the rent was 2 weeks late and the landlord was threatening eviction, my father responded with serenity. Money is just energy in motion. We need to trust in the cosmic flow. Needless to say, this philosophy didn't impress the landlord, a practical middle-aged man named Murray, who firmly believed that the cosmic flow should manifest in the form of a check by the 5th business day of the month. My mother, on the other hand, was the embodiment of relentless pragmatism. Raised in the Bronx by a nurse mother who worked double shifts to support her, she learned early on that dreams are luxuries that need to be financed with hard work and meticulous planning. She religiously woke up at 5 a.m., even on Sundays, because every hour slept is an hour of lost productivity. She held 3 jobs simultaneously while studying theater: waitress at a diner during mornings, receptionist at a medical office in the afternoons, and bartender at a jazz bar on Friday and Saturday nights. She saved every penny with the discipline of an ascetic monk and kept a notebook where she noted absolutely all expenses, even the 25 cents for the gum she occasionally allowed herself as an extravagance. For her, the future wasn't something that simply happened. It was something you built brick by brick, with a 5-year plan that included financial, professional, and personal goals, reviewed quarterly. Dreams are wonderful, she used to say, but paid bills are better. And guess what? With planning, you can have both. Their approaches to solving everyday problems perfectly illustrated this personality abyss. When the shower broke, my father suggested feeling the energy of the plumbing and tried to fix the problem by reciting mantras to the pipes. My mother, after 5 minutes observing this alternative technique, grabbed a screwdriver, disassembled the valve, replaced a worn washer she had identified as the problem, and restored the shower's function in less than 20 minutes. The question that revealed everything. Years later, when I was already an adult and beginning to better understand the complex dynamics that had shaped my childhood, I asked my father a question during one of those rare moments of genuine vulnerability that sometimes unexpectedly arise between parents and children. We were sitting on the porch of his house in Ojai, watching the sunset paint the sky with shades of orange and pink. He had just published his 3rd book of poetry, finally achieving the critical recognition he had always sought. I noticed how he seemed simultaneously fulfilled and restless, as if success, once achieved, wasn't exactly what he had imagined. "Dad," I began, swirling the glass of red wine in my hands, "this obsession of yours with proving your worth, with being the best at everything you do, with working to exhaustion, does that have anything to do with Mom?" He remained silent for so long that I thought he hadn't heard my question. His eyes, always expressive behind the glasses that now had more modern frames, seemed to be watching a movie that only he could see, a private documentary about his youth and the choices that had brought him to that moment. Finally, he sighed deeply and answered, "Your mother constantly challenged me, in ways I didn't even know I needed to be challenged. She looked at me and didn't see the brilliant young professor everyone praised. She saw an incomplete man, insufficient, too immature for the real world. At first, this infuriated me. How dare she judge me like that? I had diplomas, knowledge, potential." He paused to take a sip of wine before continuing. "But then, something strange happened. I began to want to prove to her that she was wrong, that I could be practical, responsible, successful in terms that the world values, not just in my own esoteric terms. I started waking up earlier, planning better, thinking about the concrete future, not just abstract concepts." His eyes met mine with a rare intensity. And the most surprising thing? Even after we separated, I continued wanting to show her, "See, I am capable. I'm not that lost boy you met." She lit this spark in me, this need to prove my worth not just in the world of ideas, but in the real world where people live, love, and struggle. Was it painful? My God, yes, it was like tearing off my skin. Was it transformative? Absolutely. Without her, I would probably still be living in my parents' basement, writing poetry that no one would read and blaming the world for not recognizing my misunderstood genius. He smiled with a mixture of nostalgia and gratitude. "Your mother was the greatest challenge of my life, and also my greatest teacher." The pregnancy and the small miracle, a last act of joint creation. Contrary to what many people assume, my parents didn't get pregnant in the first months of unbridled passion. In fact, they had been together for about 5 years when I finally came into the picture, after approximately 4 years of a turbulent relationship. My conception wasn't planned. As my mother likes to say, with her characteristic acid humor, "You were the only thing in my life that happened without a 5-year plan and an Excel spreadsheet." Apparently, a combination of antibiotics my mother was taking for a sinus infection and my father's mistaken belief that cosmic energy would prevent a pregnancy if it wasn't the right time resulted in the surprise that was me. When they discovered the pregnancy, their relationship was already in its twilight. The fundamental differences that initially attracted them like opposite poles of a magnet had transformed into constant sources of conflict and resentment. They had tried to separate twice before, only to be pulled back into each other's orbit by the gravitational force of that first love they never managed to replicate with other people. My birth was almost a last gasp of that already deteriorating relationship, like a star that shines most intensely before completely going out. During the pregnancy, there was a period of truce, a temporary armistice where both united around the idea of becoming parents. My father finally got a stable job as a full-time professor at a community college. My mother reduced her workload to 2 jobs and began decorating a small room for me with furniture found in thrift stores and restored with her own hands. For 9 months, they lived the illusion that a baby could fill the fundamental gaps between them. As my father wrote in a poem years later, "For 9 months, we believed in alchemy, that our gold would be forged from the lead of our differences, that a new life could resurrect what was already dead between us." I was born on a rainy October morning after 36 hours of labor. My mother refused to take anesthesia, insisting that she wanted to feel every second of the process, while my father fainted twice during the delivery and had to be attended to by nurses who found his condition more worrying than that of the woman in labor. They stayed together for exactly 1 year after my birth. The day after my first birthday, a modest party with a vegan cake that my father had tried to make following a cosmic recipe that resulted in something with the consistency of cement. My mother packed 2 suitcases, picked me up, and told him it was over. "We tried, Thomas. God knows we tried. But we're destroying each other, and now we have a daughter who deserves happy parents, even if separated." He didn't try to stop her. As he told me years later, he knew she was right, as she usually was about practical matters of life. It was like waking up from a feverish dream, he said. Painful, but necessary. A chaotic childhood, navigating between two worlds. My childhood? If I could summarize it in one word, it would be chaotic. In two words, painfully chaotic. The first 10 years were especially difficult, not just from a logistical point of view, being dragged between two houses with such radically different lifestyles that they seemed like distinct planets, but mainly emotionally and psychologically. My mother's house was a small but impeccably organized apartment in Echo Park. Each object had its designated place. There were schedules for everything: meals, bath, homework, bedtime, and clear rules about behavior, responsibilities, and consequences. The refrigerator displayed a detailed calendar with color codes for different activities, and even my toys were organized in labeled boxes: dolls, building blocks, art materials. By age 6, I already knew how to operate the washing machine, prepare a nutritious sandwich, and make my own bed with perfect hospital corners. My mother firmly believed that independence and self-discipline were the greatest gifts she could give me. My father's house, on the other hand, was a constantly changing apartment, as he moved frequently following teaching opportunities or simply because the energy of the place was no longer aligned. It could be an industrial loft in downtown one month and a cabin in the mountains the next. There were no fixed schedules for anything. We dined when we felt hungry, slept when we were tired, and the rules were more philosophical suggestions than concrete guidelines. At his house, I could build forts with all available pillows and blankets and leave them up for days. We could impulsively decide to make pancakes at 3 a.m. because culinary inspiration doesn't follow conventional clocks. My toys freely mixed with his books, vinyl records, and strange artifacts he collected on his travels: crystals, statues of Hindu deities, and exotic musical instruments that none of us knew how to play. Navigating between these two worlds was like living simultaneously in parallel universes. I became an expert in adaptation, changing personality like someone changing clothes. With my mother, I was the responsible, organized, and pragmatic child. With my father, I was the dreamer, creative, and spontaneous. Somewhere between these extremes, I tried to discover who I really was. The human intercom. When a child becomes a mediator, their separation was like a nuclear explosion that continued to release toxic radiation for years. The epicenter had been that day after my first birthday, but the shock waves and contamination persisted for more than a decade. The fundamental problem. The fundamental problem wasn't that they hated each other. In fact, I suspect they continued loving each other in complicated and painful ways they never managed to articulate. The problem was that they couldn't communicate directly without the conversation degenerating into an emotional battlefield where old wounds were reopened and new resentments created. So, I became the human intercom between them. From ages 2 to 15, I was the messenger, the diplomat, the translator of unexpressed feelings and unmet expectations. It was a role for which I had no training, supervision, or any kind of emotional preparation. Messages flowed through me in an endless cycle of coded frustrations. Tell your father he's late with child support, again, and that financial commitments are just as important as emotional ones. Tell your mother I'm not late, I'm reorganizing my finances for a more sustainable flow, and that not everything in life can be reduced to numbers in a spreadsheet. Ask your father if he's going to pick you up this weekend or if he's going to reorganize that too, like he did for the last 3 weeks. Tell your mother I'll be there but arriving a bit later because I have an important lecture, and that maybe you could stay until Monday morning so we can make up for the time. Let your father know that Monday morning you have school, and that education is a priority, not an inconvenience in his calendar. And so on, in a dysfunctional ballet where I was simultaneously dancer and choreographer, trying to smooth edges, translate intentions, and protect both sides from words that could cause even more damage. Imagine what this does to a developing child, especially in a phase where you're forming your emotional security, your self-esteem, and your psychological foundations for future relationships. We're talking about the construction of childhood wounds that would later present very high bills, with compound interest, monetary correction, and a particularly cruel service fee called dysfunctional relationship patterns repeated in adult life. I learned too early to read facial microexpressions, to anticipate emotional reactions, to mediate conflicts, and to sacrifice my own needs to keep the peace. Impressive skills for an 8-year-old child, devastating for a woman trying to build relationships. Emotional refuges, finding shelter amidst the storm. Despite the emotional chaos that characterized my childhood, I found refuges that allowed me to survive and eventually flourish. My mother, with all her rigidity and pragmatism, did the best she could with the emotional tools she possessed. She herself carried deep scars from her childhood in the Bronx of the 50s and 60s, facing racism and prejudice that shaped her in ways she might not fully understand. When I was 9, I accidentally discovered an old diary of hers while looking for scissors in the kitchen cabinet. In it, I read about how, at 12, she was prevented from entering her white best friend's birthday party because the girl's parents didn't feel comfortable with her presence. I read about how her 6th grade teacher suggested she shouldn't dream so big when my mother said she wanted to be a doctor. I read about nights crying silently so as not to wake my grandmother, who worked so hard to raise her alone. This discovery transformed my perception. I began to see her rigidity not as coldness, but as armor. Her obsession with planning not as control, but as a desperate attempt to create security where there had never been any. Her insistence on my independence not as abandonment, but as preparation for a world she knew to be merciless to those who aren't prepared. With my father, I found a different kind of refuge. While my mother's house was a sanctuary of stability and predictability, being with my father was like entering an unpredictable carnival, where reality was malleable and imagination reigned supreme. He constantly made me laugh, transforming mundane situations into epic adventures. A simple dinner became a culinary expedition where spaghetti transformed into tentacles of a mythical kraken. Tomato sauce was the blood of dragons defeated in battle, and meatballs were distant planets we needed to conquer with our spaceships, forks. When it rained and we couldn't go out, he transformed the living room into a shadow theater, using lamps, stretched sheets, and his skillful hands to tell stories about warrior princesses, always based on me, who saved entire kingdoms with their intelligence and courage. He never told stories where princesses waited to be rescued. In his narrative universe, women were always the heroines of their own journeys. On clear nights, we would climb to the roof of his building with an old telescope he had bought at a thrift store. He taught me about constellations, not just their scientific names, but also the mythological stories behind them. See that star there? It's part of Andromeda. She was chained to a rock as a sacrifice, but freed herself with Perseus's help. However, in my version, she breaks the chains herself and then saves Perseus from a sea monster. These experiences gave me something precious: the ability to find magic in everyday life, to see possibilities where others see limitations, to believe that stories can be rewritten and that imagination is a form of freedom that no one can take away from you. But the truth is that, despite these moments of light, my father was fundamentally inconsistent. He worked obsessively in the Hollywood industry as a sound editor, often disappearing for weeks when a project required endless hours. As he himself admitted years later, during a rare, honest conversation, I was an immature man having children. I didn't know how to balance my dreams with my responsibilities. He didn't know how to establish boundaries, neither for himself nor for me. He didn't have the courage to face the difficult parts of parenting, preferring to be the fun dad who showed up with extravagant gifts and crazy ideas, but who disappeared when it was time to deal with night fevers, school meetings, or the consistent presence that a child needs to develop emotional security. He didn't have the awareness, or perhaps the capacity, to understand that children need constant presence, not just sporadic fun moments. As a result, I grew up with a confused internal pattern. I associated love with intensity and intermittence, not with constancy and reliability. The journey to healing, reconciliation, and growth. In my 20s, when I finally had enough financial and emotional independence to seek serious therapy, I went through an intense phase of victimization. Sitting on the leather couch in my therapist's office, a middle-aged woman with tortoiseshell glasses and a supernatural ability to remain silent for exactly the time needed to make me keep talking, I repeated my self-pity mantra. It's not fair. Why did they do this to me? How could they be so selfish, so blind to my needs? I was just a child. Week after week, I poured out my anger, my sadness, my resentment. I blamed my parents for every insecurity, every failed relationship, every moment of paralyzing anxiety I experienced. It was easier to point fingers than to look inward and do the painful work of healing. It was my therapist who finally challenged me, after almost a year of sessions. How much longer will you live as a victim of your story, instead of its author? The question hit me like a slap. Not a cruel slap, but one that wakes you from a trance. I realized I was stuck in a loop of resentment that kept me connected to the past, preventing me from creating a different future. The real healing process began when I finally had the courage to confront both of them, not with accusations, but with truths. During a visit to my mother, while we washed dishes side by side after dinner, we always had our most honest conversations while doing household chores together. I took a deep breath and said, "Mom, remember when you used to send messages to Dad through me? Like a human carrier pigeon?" It was very difficult for me. I felt responsible for your communication, for his mood, for your reactions. It was a huge burden for a child. She stopped rinsing the plate she was holding, the water running uselessly. I saw her face reflect first surprise, then pain, and finally a painful understanding. I never thought of it that way, she replied, her voice softer than usual. I was so focused on my own pain, my anger with your father, that I didn't realize what we were doing to you. I'm sorry, dear. I truly am sorry. That I'm sorry, simple, direct, without justifications, was like a key unlocking a door that had remained closed for decades. My mother was the most receptive to the reconciliation process. When I suggested that perhaps we needed help to rebuild our relationship, she didn't hesitate. "Yes, I'm here. What can we do to remedy this? Let's do therapy together if you think it would help." She began to meditate with me, to really listen to me not as the daughter who needed direction, but as an adult woman sharing her truth. She started participating in conscious communication workshops and reading books about intergenerational trauma. At 65, my mother was doing emotional work that many people refuse to do even at 30. With my father, the process was slower and more complicated. When I tried to have the same honest conversation with him, his first reaction was defensive. I did the best I could with what I had at the time. You don't understand how difficult it was for me too. But I planted the seed, and with time, and a few more attempts, it began to germinate. One afternoon, almost a year after my first attempt, he called me out of the blue. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, without preamble. "About what it was like growing up between us two. I've been rereading my diaries from that time and, well, I think you're right. We used you as a shield, as a mediator. It wasn't your role. It was our job to protect you, not the other way around. It was a beginning, not a complete resolution, but an acknowledgement. The first necessary step for any healing journey. The reality of personality formation. The fundamental problem with childhood traumas, as I discovered both in therapy and in my own later research on child development, is that from 0 to 12 years old, the basic structure of your personality is formed. There's no way to go back and completely rewrite that story. What's done is, to a large extent, done. The neurological patterns established during these formative years are incredibly resistant to change. The fundamental beliefs about yourself, about relationships, about trust and security are engraved at such a deep level that they often operate completely outside our consciousness. As my therapist explained, using a metaphor I never forgot, it's as if during childhood, you were building the foundations and basic structure of a house. In adolescence, you put up the walls and roof. In adult life, you can redecorate, tear down some non-structural walls, add extensions, but the foundations remain the same. You can build on top of them, work with them, but you can't simply rip them out and start over without bringing down the entire structure. This doesn't mean we're doomed to repeat our childhood patterns forever. It means that healing doesn't come from denial or attempting to erase the past, but from recognition, understanding, and consciously building new experiences that gradually create new neurological pathways. We can remedy, we can build new connections, new understandings. We can learn to recognize when we're operating from those old patterns and consciously choose different responses. It's a lifelong work, sometimes exhausting, always challenging, but infinitely valuable. My mother, the unexpected anchor. Today at 44, I get along incredibly well with my mother. Our relationship has evolved from a traditional mother-daughter dynamic to something that more closely resembles a deep friendship between women who respect each other, even if they occasionally get irritated by each other's habits. What I value most about her is her genuine willingness to be present, to continue growing, to be the best version of herself not just for her children, but for herself. Unlike many of her generation, she never crystallized in her opinions or habits. At 70, she is still open to new ideas, new perspectives, new ways of understanding the world and herself. There is nothing more painful than absent parents, especially those who justify their distance with phrases like, "Better not to call you so as not to bother you," or, "I thought you were too busy with your own life to worry about me." These transparent excuses usually mask fear of intimacy, inability for vulnerability, or simply distorted priorities. My mother was never like that. Even in the most turbulent periods of our relationship, she maintained contact. She is always there with a, "Hello, daughter. How are you? I'm your mother. I had you when I was 24. It's been a long time since we talked. I'm here. I would like to see you. Let's have tea." When I tell her that something in her behavior bothers or hurts me, her response is never defensive. It's always, "I understand. Let's talk about it. How can we resolve this?" This willingness for dialogue, for self-reflection, for change, even at an advanced age, is perhaps the greatest gift she gave me. Not perfection, no one is perfect, but the model of how to continue evolving, how to keep the heart and mind open, how to prioritize relationships above ego. New family, new chapters. Breaking cycles. In the last 5 or 6 years, my life has taken turns that not even the most imaginative Hollywood screenwriter could predict. I've lived under the relentless spotlight of global media since I met Harry, a man who, despite his privileged birth, carries his own childhood traumas as deep as mine. Harry has been more present in my life than my own father during this period. Not just as a romantic partner, but as an ally, confidant, and eventually co-parent of our children. Our connection was immediate and profound. Two adults with complicated childhoods, recognizing in each other both the wounds and the determination not to allow those wounds to define the future. Harry is a great man, not because of the titles he carried or the family he was born into, but because of the person he has chosen to become despite the circumstances. I see this primarily through the eyes of our son Archie, our firstborn, and our daughter Lilibet, who arrived to complete our family. Archie is the center of our world and has helped me immensely to find my purpose. At 4 years old, he is curious, compassionate, and inexplicably wise for his age, as if he was born with an intuitive understanding that many adults never achieve. He loves his father with that pure adoration that only small children can express, running to the door shouting, "Daddy, Daddy," whenever Harry comes home, no matter if he's been gone for 5 hours or 5 minutes. Watching them together, building pillow forts, planting vegetables in the garden, or simply reading bedtime stories, gives me a sense of healing by proxy. It's as if each moment of conscious parenting that Harry provides our children also heals a bit of that boy he was, and by extension, the girl I was. Harry is a close partner and has always been extremely responsible. We've never lacked anything at home, not just materially, but emotionally. He has always been present, working tirelessly to care for our family, to create a safe environment where we can all be fully ourselves. He understands, in a way that few can, the value of consistent presence, honest communication, healthy boundaries. Perhaps because he grew up in an environment where these things were rarely offered, he makes a point of providing them in abundance. Together, we are determined to break the cycles of trauma we inherited. We do individual and couples therapy regularly. We openly discuss our emotional triggers and problematic patterns. We study child development and conscious parenting practices. We aren't perfect, far from it, but we are committed to the ongoing work of self-awareness and growth. As for the royal family, well, it's complicated. I respect them immensely and was always moved to see them. There are centuries-old traditions and protocols that carry their own beauty and meaning, but there are also rigid structures that can stifle individualities and perpetuate problematic patterns. Our decision to step back and build our own life wasn't taken lightly. It was the result of years of reflection, attempts at adaptation, and finally, the understanding that to be the best possible parents for our children, we needed to create an environment where we could all breathe freely. Final reflections. The continuing journey. Today, looking back, I see that Shakespearean love story between my parents, with all its drama and intensity, shaped me deeply. The wounds transformed into wisdom, the challenges into strength, the difficult experiences into capacity for empathy. We don't choose the circumstances of our birth or our childhood. We don't choose our parents or the patterns they inadvertently pass on to us. but we can choose what we do with that inheritance. We can perpetuate the cycles or work consciously to break them. My parents gave me many things, some intentionally, others not. From my mother, I inherited determination, pragmatism, and the ability to face adversities head-on. From my father, I received creativity, love for language, and the ability to find beauty in unexpected places. But perhaps the greatest gift that both gave me, through their imperfect and tumultuous union, was the opportunity to witness both the power and the danger of intense love. I learned that love without self-knowledge can be destructive, that passion without mutual respect eventually implodes, that healthy relationships require more than just strong feelings. They demand conscious work, honest communication, and the courage to face our own shadows. This is a lesson I carry with me every day as I navigate my own marriage, my motherhood, and my continuing journey of self-discovery. It's a journey without a defined end, just milestones along the way that indicate growth, healing, and occasionally, relapses into old patterns that require new attention. As my father's favorite poem says, which he used to recite to me before bed, "Healing is not a destination we reach, but a journey we travel daily." Each conscious step takes us away from the past and brings us closer to the future we choose to create.